There's some big themes, some big ideas with the endocrine system. This chapter, and there's only one chapter dedicated to the endocrine system in your textbook, is an entire field of study. For those of you who go into graduate programs, you'll probably have a 3-credit graduate class called Endocrinology, just dedicated to the endocrine system. Our goal for this chapter is kind of superficial stuff. We're going to focus on the first half of the chapter from your textbook, primarily name that gland, name that hormone, and name the function of the hormone. If we had another week of class, we'd spend a lot of time talking about the biochemistry of the different kinds of hormones and delivery methods of those hormones. But such is life, we don't have enough time. So let's dive in and talk about the endocrine system. And as we look at the endocrine system, some of the general themes include control of the body. And when we think endocrine, I want you to think internal signalings or internal signals. Endo meaning in, and this endocrine system, depending on your frame of reference, sometimes a specific chemical can be an endocrine hormone. Other times, that specific chemical, the exact same chemical, could be used as a neurotransmitter. There are well over 30 different neurotransmitters that have been identified and studied. We'll talk about some of them, not all of them, for our Unit 4 when we focus on the nervous system. Now, when we look at the endocrine system does a lot of big picture things for us. It helps us to maintain homeostasis, that relatively constant internal environment, with long-term, hour to day to weeks kinds of a response. When we look at stress adaptation, how do we handle the hormones of stress? How do we handle the hormones of digestion? It gets to be fairly complicated. So we're taking most of the digestive hormones and saving them for Bio 314 when we talk about the digestive system. We'll talk about a few of the digestive hormones in this unit. Some of the other hormones, like the hormones associated with regulating blood pressure or urine production, we'll mention very briefly in this unit, but then in Bio 314, we'll talk about them in a lot more detail when we get to the cardiovascular and urinary system. And then also the hormones associated with the reproductive system, we'll mention very briefly in this unit. And then in Bio 314, we'll talk about them in a lot more detail. So in terms of the usefulness of this unit, or this chapter is really going to set the foundation for you to kick butt in Bio 314 next semester. So, as we're looking at the endocrine system, we have different methods of communicating, of sending the signals, and different ways to move the signals. We have gap junctions in our body. Think back to, I want to say, Chapter 3, Unit 1. We talked about gap junctions, which are holes that allow for the signal, the cytoplasm, from one cell to flow directly into an adjacent cell. And these gap junctions are important for allowing this hormone of the endocrine system to be transmitted from one cell to the next cell. Sometimes, in response to a hormone, we're going to release a neurotransmitter, or sometimes in response to a mechanical or physical stimulus, we'll release these neurotransmitters. A neurotransmitter is a chemical that starts an action potential. And as we're thinking of these action potentials, remember, an action potential is an electrical signal moving across the cell. We're also going to have some paracrines. And when we think of paracrines, I want you to think of these as localized signaling molecules. So these paracrine signaling molecules, they're kind of like a signal that tells the next door neighbor or the adjacent cells within a tissue about something that's happening to whatever your favorite cell is. My favorite example of a paracrine is going to be the interleukins from the immune system. And those interleukins will tell neighboring cells when the host cell is infected with the virus and confer mild immunity to neighboring cells based on whatever virus is infecting that host cell. We also are going to have lots of hormones, lots and lots and lots of hormones that we're going to be talking about in this presentation. And we have 3 days dedicated to the endocrine system. Now, when we look at the endocrine system, our endocrine system is going to consist primarily of the glands that make the secretions themselves, those hormones made by the glands, and depending on your frame of reference, we could also include a little bit of the cardiovascular system, because the blood vessels are used to transmit those hormones. And yes, I am recording. I just wanted to double check on that. Let's minimize that. There we go. When we look at the study of the endocrine system, the study of the endocrine system is known as endocrinology, ology meaning the study of. When we look at an endocrine gland, these are known as our traditional sources of hormones. And a good example of this would be how we used to harvest insulin. Traditionally, if somebody had diabetes, it was more or less a death sentence. It really resulted in them having a very short death or a very reduced lifespan. And then we found that you could give somebody insulin to help them control their blood sugar. But 100 years ago, there weren't necessarily really good sources of insulin. Most insulin that was used by diabetics came from dogs, horses, or pigs. And the dogs, horses, and pigs would be sent to the factory, they'd be killed, their pancreas would be pulled out, and then they would essentially kind of squeeze the pancreas and then filter the juices that came out, and then people would use that for their insulin injections. It was a messy, dirty, inefficient, and not very effective way to get insulin. But now we have ways of isolating these hormones, and we can get these hormones without using an endocrine gland. So when we think of insulin now, we have fast-acting insulin, we have slow-acting insulin, and these different variations of insulin have all been engineered by biotech companies and are mass-produced by E. coli bacterium, completely absent of the endocrine glands. But traditionally, we used to have to harvest the hormones from the glands directly. And then there's those hormones themselves. When we think of a hormone, I want you to think of a chemical messenger. And this chemical messenger is going to stay in the body, and it's going to start at one tissue and travel to another tissue. And when we say a considerable distance, I want you to think from one or it at least has to change organs. So these are going to be inter-organ signals, not intra-organ signals. So here's an overview of some of the glands that we're going to be talking about today. In our brain, we have several key glands that we're going to be talking about. We'll spend most of our time on the pituitary gland, the master gland of the brain. We'll spend a little bit of time on the hypothalamus and a little bit of time on the pineal gland as well within the brain. Those three key glands within the brain. Around the larynx, we're going to have the thyroid glands. And then next to those thyroid glands, we have the parathyroids. We'll also cover the adrenals, which are superior to the kidneys. We'll cover the thymus, which is at the inferior margin of the trachea. We'll cover the pancreas, which is right next to the stomach, I should say. And then we'll also cover the gonads. Male gonads are testes. Female gonads are ovaries. So those are the primary glands we're going to be focusing on with our review of the endocrine system. Now, depending on how we look at it, sometimes we'll have an exocrine function, sometimes we'll have an endocrine function. So let's review this terminology. This is review for you. Exocrine glands make secretions that leave the body. Now, they might not leave the body right away, or they might actually leave the body right away. An example of an exocrine secretion that leaves right away would be your sweat. It immediately goes to the surface of your skin and then evaporates away. An example of a secretion that does not leave right away would be the pepsinogen secreted by the chief cells in your stomach. That pepsinogen has to work its way through your digestive tract, and eventually, typically 12 to 24 hours after it's secreted, it will be defecated out as you have a bowel movement. So when we think of these exocrine glands, they eventually are going to be external secretions. Now when we think of endocrine glands don't have ducts. Instead of having ducts, they use the bloodstream, the cardiovascular system, for tubes and for the network of distributing our hormones. When we think of endocrine, I want you to think endo, inside. These are going to be internal only secretions. these secretions will not exit the body until they've gone through chemical alterations. Typically, they've been broken down by the kidney and or liver before they're secreted. Now, when we look at endocrine glands, they have a fenestrated capillary network, and that's a vocabulary word that we haven't talked about yet. So let's pause for a moment on fenestrated. When we think of a fenestrated capillary network, I want you to think of a capillary network that's very, very porous. Some capillaries allow diffusion to occur quicker than other capillaries. There's 3 categories of capillaries in our body. When we get to the cardiovascular system, we'll talk about that in more detail next semester. Right now, I just want you to kind of put in your margins that they are extra permeable capillaries. That's what we mean by fenestrated. And because they're extra permeable, it's really, really easy to dump these hormones into the bloodstream with our endocrine glands. Now, we also have the liver. And the liver, you know, there's constant argument. It's the never-ending debate. What body system do we categorize the liver in? Is it digestive? Is it an endocrine? Is it a cardiovascular? The liver is kind of a multi-purpose organ. It's the jack of all trades. It does a little bit of a lot of different things. So we're going to mention the liver now because of some of the hormones it secretes. Your textbook categorizes the liver with the digestive system, though, so we'll spend most of our time in Bio 314 talking about our livers. Let's compare and contrast endocrine versus nervous systems. Both of these systems function to send information. They're methods of communication in our bodies. But as we look at these methods of communication, there's some differences we can compare and contrast. The nervous system is really fast. It's going to send a signal from one part of the body to another part of the body in a matter of milliseconds. The endocrine system, though, doesn't have that rapid response time. It takes a while to upregulate the signal. It takes a while for those chemicals to be transported, to diffuse across membranes, and then get to the target site in the target cell. So when we think of endocrine signals, these are going to take seconds or days, depending on the hormone. An example of a hormone that works in seconds is adrenaline. After you get a boost of adrenaline, usually within a couple of seconds, you feel the results. For those of you who've been scared, or maybe like somebody's jumped out of the closet to scare you, they make you jump, you have some adrenaline secreted, and within 2 or 3 seconds, you can feel your heart rate go up, your pupils dilate, you start to sweat. You notice the effect of the adrenaline very, very quickly. And then other hormones take longer, hours or days. And these hormones are typically going to be the protein-based hormones that are going to have a harder time diffusing through the cell membranes and transmitting their signals. Now, when we look at how our adaptation to long-term stimuli is, the nervous system can adapt pretty quickly. Any of you who have ever worn a pair of glasses or a pair of earrings, or even right now, you're all wearing clothes, you probably aren't consciously aware of these things dangling on your body. Your nervous system has adapted, and you've kind of just zoned out that information or tuned out that information. You adapt nervously, or from a nervous system perspective, in a pretty short period of time. Now, from an endocrine perspective, it takes days to weeks to months to adapt to these hormones. So think of individuals that maybe are in a chronic stress situation. If you're chronically being stressed, it takes a while to go from a beneficial stress response to a harmful stress response. And as you're slowly adapting and going through that alteration, it takes time. Think of people that are addicted to caffeine, like yours truly. It takes a while to get this addiction. I remember the first couple espressos I drank in my life. The first time I drank a 5-hour energy, it was amazing. But once you start drinking as much coffee as I do, you need to maintain that minimum baseline just to function. And that was a long-term adaptation. Let's talk about target areas. The nervous system is very targeted. It's your precision-guided missile of your body, in that you're going to send a signal to the specific axon of, the specific synapse of the specific axon for the specific neuron that you activated. It's very targeted. Whereas the endocrine system will send those hormones into the bloodstream, and from the bloodstream, they go everywhere, and they expose everything in your body to the hormone. So we have precision targeting versus kind of more of a, let's just kind of a shotgun effect. Let's just spread it everywhere and see what happens. There's some other key differences between the endocrine system and the nervous system. As we're looking at these chemicals, some chemicals will function as a hormone or a neurotransmitter, depending on the body system. So when we think of norepinephrine, which is also known as noradrenaline, it's a hormone and it's a neurotransmitter. Dopamine, we typically think of as one of the happy neurotransmitters, one of those neurotransmitters that make you feel happy if you have lots of dopamine dumped into your brain. But we also can use dopamine as a hormone. It has those hormone effects. If we think of antidiuretic hormone, we traditionally associate this chemical as being a hormone, but it also has been found to act as a neurotransmitter. It can induce action potentials within neurons. We also find, as we compare and contrast the endocrine and the nervous system, that they can have similar effects on the same target cell. So that norepinephrine, this is a big one here. This norepinephrine can cause your liver to turn glycogen into glucose. Norepinephrine is a hormone associated with a stress response. So when you're stressed out, that norepinephrine can make it so that you release sugar into your bloodstream. We also could use a hormone called glucagon. And glucagon is also going to take glycogen from your liver and stimulate the conversion of glycogen into glucose. So the same effect, different hormone. We also find that the endocrine and the nervous systems can interactivate each other. There were 3 glands I circled a couple slides ago. The pituitary gland, the hypothalamus, and the pineal gland. Those endocrine glands are made of brain tissue. And they're a classic example of how we can have an interface between the endocrine system and the nervous system. There's another gland in the body, the adrenal gland, which is really a 2-in-1. We have it's half endocrine, half nervous system. And they can be activated by either the hormones or activated by action potentials from the nervous system. That's another good example of an interface, the adrenal glands. And then finally, when we look at these neuroendocrine cells, these neuroendocrine cells are cells that respond both to neurotransmitters and to hormones. A neuroendocrine cell is going to be able to produce action potentials, and it produces hormones. It's one of those overlaps. A good example of a neuroendocrine cell is going to be some of the cells in the hypothalamus. The cells of the hypothalamus are neurons, but these particular cells in the hypothalamus these particular neurons will make a hormone called oxytocin. So there's going to be some parts of the body that really are hard to categorize, like the neuroendocrine cells. Now, as we look at a target organ or a target cell, regardless of the endocrine system or the nervous system, these target organs or target cells need to have the correct receptors. If they don't have the correct receptors, nothing's going to happen. It's kind of like having a door that the message can get through, or a way for the message to be delivered. So as we're looking at a nervous system perspective, if the target cells don't have protein receptors for those neurotransmitters are going to hit the cell membrane and then bounce off and do nothing. So if we don't have that receptor, we're not going to get the response. As we look at an endocrine perspective, the hormones are dumped into the bloodstream and then travel to a different tissue type and then go to the target cells. And those target cells need to be receptive. They need to have the correct protein receptors on the surface for that signal to get inside and make a difference. No receptor, no effect. So we'll start from the top, both literally and figuratively. We'll start with the hypothalamus, then we'll talk about the pituitary gland. And as we're diving through and talking about these glands, if we could get through just the anterior pituitary today, I'm going to be thrilled, because the pituitary is the beast. It has the most hormones by far of the endocrine system. So as we look at the hypothalamus, let's break apart this word and look at the root terms. Hypo means beneath. What is the hypothalamus beneath? It's beneath the part of the brain called the thalamus. So in our brains, here's a mid-sagittal slice of the brain, we have a region right here known as the thalamus. And then inferior to that, we have the hypothalamus. Now when we think of the hypothalamus, this is part of what's oftentimes referred to as the reptilian brain. This part of the brain regulates very primitive life functions, or things that you absolutely need to stay alive or perpetuate the species. So if we think of core body temperature, if we think of regulating body thirst, if we think of our libido or our sex drive, these are all key functions that are regulated by the hypothalamus of our brain. And then as we're looking at the hypothalamus, it's intimately connected with the pituitary gland that's directly inferior to that. So here's another view of the hypothalamus and its different regions. So here's our hypothalamus, and then it's directly connected to the pituitary gland that hangs inferiorly to the hypothalamus. Probably my favorite example of the hypothalamus and how it regulates the body, and I'm stealing an analogy from our next unit, or a story from our next unit, is the hypothalamus. The part of the hypothalamus that regulates body temperature is one of the last parts of the brain to be developed before you're born. It typically is going to be developed around 32 weeks of age, or 32 weeks of gestation, I should say. So what we find is that for individuals that are prematurely born, particularly before 33, 32 weeks of gestation, their hypothalamus cannot regulate their body temperature yet, and those prematurely born infants are put into incubators to externally regulate their body temperatures. So let's look at the pituitary gland. Our pituitary gland is kind of a twofer, a two-in-one. We have the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. Our anterior pituitary, if you're looking at the microscope slides in lab, is typically going to be the darker stained or the darker colored region. And then the posterior pituitary is going to be lighter in appearance. As we're looking at the two kind of spherical, almost spherical portions of the pituitary gland, they are going to hang down or dangle down from the hypothalamus by a small piece of connective tissue known as the infundibulum. So the infundibulum I'm circling right now, it's sometimes also referred to as the stalk, but the infundibulum is the technical name for that tiny extension of nervous tissue that connects the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus. When I've led students through brain dissections, and I've had probably, I'm spitballing here, probably about 400 or 500 students, or 400 or 500 individual brains dissected in my labs so far. I've seen 2 students in my career be able to remove the covering of the brain and keep the pituitary gland connected to the hypothalamus. That infundibulum is super tiny and breaks very, very easily during brain dissections. It's also worth emphasizing that the pituitary gland is located inside of the sella turcica, that small indentation inside of the sphenoid bone. So when we think of somebody who's having a pituitary tumor and needs to have their pituitary gland worked on, and I know 3 individuals who've had this done, the traditional approach is to take the surgical instruments around the outside of the eyeball and go straight in from an anterior approach to get to the pituitary gland so that they don't have to damage all the brain tissue that's superficial to that or superior to that. As we're looking at our pituitary gland, the technical name for the anterior pituitary is known as the adenohypophysis. And then the technical name for the posterior pituitary gland is the neurohypophysis. So let's talk about the adenohypophysis, or the anterior pituitary. This is the part of the pituitary gland that is going to make a lot of hormones. So when we think of this part of the pituitary gland, I need to emphasize a couple things. It makes hormones. It makes a lot of hormones. It's also the biggest part of the pituitary gland. It makes up about 3/4 of the volume of our pituitary gland. Now, to control this part of the pituitary gland, most of the control is going to come from the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus will release hormones. Those hormones will travel through the blood capillaries of the infundibulum, get to the anterior pituitary, and while those hormones are in the anterior pituitary, they will stimulate the anterior pituitary to make other hormones. And then once those hormones are made by the anterior pituitary, they're secreted. So we need to emphasize that the anterior pituitary is going to make the hormones in response to a signal from the hypothalamus. And then we have the posterior pituitary gland. Our posterior pituitary does not do as much. It's about 1/4 the overall volume of the pituitary gland, as opposed to 3/4 with the anterior pituitary. And as we're looking at this posterior pituitary, or the neurohypophysis, the technical name really tells you about how this gland works. The posterior pituitary is controlled by neurons. And specifically, we find that in the hypothalamus, there are neurons in the hypothalamus that make the hormone. That hormone travels from the hypothalamus and is stored in the posterior pituitary. And then when the correct signal is given, it will be released in the posterior pituitary. So to compare and contrast, in the anterior pituitary, we make the hormone and secrete the hormone from the anterior pituitary. With the posterior pituitary, the hormone is made in the hypothalamus and then secreted from the posterior pituitary. And this is one of the reasons why the posterior pituitary is smaller. It doesn't need to have as much cellular machinery because it's not doing as much as the anterior pituitary. Another reason why the posterior pituitary is smaller is because it's not involved with as many hormones. The anterior pituitary has, I believe, 6 hormones that I want you to commit to memory, whereas the posterior pituitary has 2 hormones that I'm asking you to commit to memory. So let's have a review question. The anterior pituitary is blinkety-blink, then the posterior pituitary, and has blinkety-blink connection to the hypothalamus. Our answers are smaller, no nervous, larger, unnervous, larger, no nervous, or smaller, no nervous. So hopefully I emphasized those points enough on the last 2 slides for you. Think back to the last 2 slides of material. We're down to about 30 seconds. Which one is larger? Which one makes up 3/4 of the volume? Which one makes up 1/4? Which one is regulated by hormones? Which one is going to be regulated with neurons directly? We're down to about 10 seconds. Please make sure you answer. Get your answers in. All right. So as we look at the anterior pituitary, it's larger. It makes up 3/4 of the volume. And our anterior pituitary is going to be controlled by hormones released from the hypothalamus. So because it's controlled by the hormones, it does not have nervous system control from the hypothalamus. The posterior pituitary is smaller and does have that nervous system control from the hypothalamus. So it looks like that was kind of a tricky question for us. So I just need to emphasize that again. The anterior pituitary is controlled by hormones. The posterior pituitary has a neuron link or a nervous link to the hypothalamus. Let's talk about hormones of the hypothalamus. These hormones of the hypothalamus are primarily going to target the pituitary gland because that's what the hypothalamus is most intimately connected to. As we're looking at these hormones of the hypothalamus, 6 will regulate the anterior pituitary, 2 regulate the posterior pituitary. And as we're looking at them, we have some abbreviations. I'll go slowly through these abbreviations. The abbreviations actually make a lot of sense as we're going through them. So, TSRH is thyroid releasing hormone. When we look at GnRH, that is gonadotropin releasing hormone. And don't worry, we'll get to each of these individual hormones later on in the presentation. But I just wanted to define these acronyms for us right here. GHRH is for growth hormone releasing hormone. I love that abbreviation. It's so intuitive. And then we have CRH. And CRH, I'm having a brain hiccup right now. I want to say it's corticotropic releasing hormone, but don't quote me on that one. I need to double check because I'm having a brain hiccup. And these hormones are going to travel to the anterior pituitary gland and stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to have prolactin secreted, to have adrenocorticotropic hormone released, to have follicle stimulating hormone released, to have luteinizing hormone released, to have growth hormone released, and to have thyroid stimulating hormone released, all from the anterior pituitary gland. Let's just pause for a moment and talk about how to study for this. The best way to study the endocrine system is to make a bunch of little flashcards. And here, it takes time, but it works really, really well. Have the name of the hormone on one flashcard, have a second flashcard with the function of that hormone, and have a third flashcard with the name of a target organ, and then have a fourth flashcard with an arrow. And you can take all these flashcards and kind of jumble them up, and then you put them down on the tabletop, and you rearrange them so you have this organ makes this hormone that then use your arrow card that goes to this organ, which then secretes this hormone in response to exposure that then does this thing. It takes a while, but it's the best way to learn the hormones of the endocrine system. As we look at PIH, prolactin inhibiting hormone, prolactin inhibiting hormones inhibits the secretion of prolactin and somatostatin and growth hormone and thyroid stimulating hormone. So that prolactin inhibiting hormone is a multifunction hormone from the hypothalamus. We also have some hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus and sent to the posterior pituitary. These two hormones are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. The brand name for oxytocin, and anyone who's ever had induced labor can attest to this, is Pitocin, which is the brand name for that. And as the name implies, with Pitocin, it will help induce labor contractions. And then when we think of antidiuretic hormone, this hormone is produced in the hypothalamus and will be sent to the posterior pituitary. So they're stored and released by that posterior pituitary. I think I've said that 5 or 6 times now this class period. So please don't get those mixed up. These two hormones are made in the hypothalamus, stored in the posterior pituitary, and released from the posterior pituitary. Within the hypothalamus, the part of the hypothalamus that produces antidiuretic hormone is the supraoptic nuclei. And just to re-emphasize this again, the posterior pituitary does not synthesize hormones. It stores them and then releases them. It does not make them. We have some phenomenal pituitary gland slides that you can look at during lab. And as we're looking at the pituitary gland, really, let's just get the elephant out of the room. Yes, it looks like a scrotum. That's the analogy most students use for the pituitary gland as you look at the anterior and posterior pituitary. Our anterior pituitary, this picture really makes it look like that, I need to add as well. Our anterior pituitary is going to have a lot of reticular fibers in it. The posterior pituitary has a higher concentration of connective tissues, or collagen fibers for being dense irregular tissues. But as we're just looking at the anterior and the posterior pituitaries, they have very different histology for their very different functions. One makes and releases hormones, the other stores and releases hormones. So as we look at our anterior pituitary, to control the anterior pituitary from the hypothalamus, we're going to have blood vessels travel through the infundibulum. Those blood vessels are known as portal vanules. They are going to carry hormones away from the tissue of the hypothalamus and deliver those hormones to the tissues of the anterior pituitary. I'm not going to read these out loud, but if you're wondering about the spelling of those hormones that I gave you on this slide, there are a lot of abbreviations, and I'm willing to bet most of you didn't know how to spell all of those. The spelling is right here, and you can refer back to that at your leisure for how to spell those hormones that are released from the hypothalamus that travel to the anterior pituitary and control the release of the hormones from the anterior pituitary. And we are going to focus on all of these hormones of the anterior pituitary in detail. So let's dive in. As we look at the anterior pituitary gland, we have tropins. And the gonadotropins are by far the most commonly talked about tropins. Let's pause for a moment and look at the root words here. When we think of a gonadotropin, the prefix is gonad. These are hormones that affect the human gonads. The female gonad is the ovary, the male gonad is the testes. And then when we look at the root word tropin, a tropin is a kind of hormone that causes a different hormone to be secreted. So tropins travel to the target gland and cause the target gland to secrete another hormone. So a gonadotropin is a hormone that will travel to the gonads and cause the gonads to release other hormones. Our two gonadotropins we'll focus on are follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Follicle-stimulating hormone is going to cause the ovaries to have a follicle develop on them. So, it's a very intuitive name. Ovarian follicles develop in response to increasing follicle-stimulating hormone concentrations. As we look at the testes, or the male gonads, when they're exposed to follicle-stimulating hormone, the testes will upregulate sperm production in response to that hormone. And then we have luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone, from a female perspective, stimulates ovulation. You should circle that, put some arrows next to it. It really is one of those big questions that I will ask you that usually about 20% of the class gets wrong. What hormone stimulates ovulation will be a question in the test bank, and it is ovulation. You need to know that one. That's one of the, particularly when we think of reproductive health. Luteinizing hormone stimulates ovulation from the female perspective. Now, when we look at the male gonads, luteinizing hormone also has an effect. Luteinizing hormone is going to cause the male gonads to secrete testosterone. So when we think of testicles, they do two key things. They make sperm, and then they release testosterone. A third hormone that comes from our anterior pituitary gland is thyroid-stimulating hormone. And as the name implies, thyroid-stimulating hormone is going to stimulate the thyroid gland to do something. Specifically, the thyroid gland will release thyroid hormone when the thyroid gland is exposed to thyroid-stimulating hormone. Every once in a while, the names just make a lot of sense. Thyroid-stimulating hormone is a very intuitive name that can be associated with the function. We also have adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. This is another tropic hormone. Tropic hormones cause the target glands to release other hormones. What is the target gland? The target gland of ACTH is the adrenal cortex. So this hormone will travel to the adrenal cortex and cause it to release other hormones. Specifically, the glucocorticoids. So the hormones associated with stress responses are going to be released in response to ACTH. The anterior pituitary gland also releases prolactin. Pro is a prefix that means to promote. What does this hormone promote? It promotes lactation. And a common misconception, or a common trick question, not necessarily trick question, but a common question on exams is, which hormone causes lactation and which hormone causes a woman to release milk? Prolactin causes the lactation, but it's not enough just to make the milk in the breast. You need to get the milk out of the breast. And prolactin is not responsible for getting milk out of the breast. That's a different hormone we'll talk about in just a couple slides. Prolactin only stimulates the generation of the milk, not the release of the milk. We also have growth hormone. Sometimes it's also abbreviated as HGH for human growth hormone. And as we look at growth hormone's interesting in that it's going to cause cellular differentiation of many, many different tissue types in our bodies. It causes us to develop more bone, more cartilage, more skeletal muscle tissue. If you just want to generally grow larger, you need more growth hormone. Every once in a while, we'll find individuals that have pituitary tumors or tumors of the anterior pituitary gland, and they'll make too much growth hormone. If the tumor develops before they hit puberty, before the epiphyseal plates fused into the epiphyseal lines, those individuals can be 7 or 8 feet tall because they have rapid abnormal release of growth hormone, and their bones will grow abnormally long in response to the abnormal concentration of growth hormone. If that pituitary tumor develops after they've stopped growing taller, after they had fusion of the epiphyseal plates, they're still going to have accelerated appositional growth. And that accelerated appositional growth of the skeletal muscle, or excuse me, of the bones or the skeletal system usually results in those individuals with the pituitary tumors having really, really thick hands, really abnormally big hands. Their brow line extends, their chin extends. They have overdeveloped zygomatic arches and zygomatic bones, and their noses and ears will also be abnormally large. So here are those hormones we talked about from the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. We have the thyroid releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone, corticoid releasing hormone, and growth hormone releasing hormone, all coming from the hypothalamus going to the anterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary gland will then make prolactin, thyroid stimulating hormone, luteinizing and follicle stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic releasing hormone, and growth hormone. And growth hormone ultimately will affect the growth of adipose, muscular, and bone tissue. So let's talk about our posterior pituitary gland, that smaller portion of the pituitary. To emphasize again, the posterior pituitary does not make hormones, it stores and releases those hormones. And the two hormones that it stores and releases that we're going to focus on are antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Antidiuretic hormone is a really intuitive name. So when we think of diuretics, a diuretic is any chemical that causes you to urinate a lot. Probably the two diuretics you are going to be most familiar with are caffeine. Caffeine's known for causing an increased rate of micturition or urination. And the other one you're probably most familiar with is ethanol or grain alcohol. Both of those chemicals cause human beings to urinate a lot, have accelerated urine production. An antidiuretic is not going to accelerate the production of urine, but instead will inhibit the production of urine. And it inhibits the production of urine a very specific way. Antidiuretic hormone causes you to reabsorb water directly. I am going to repeat that again because students often mix this up with another hormone in our bodies that reduces urine output a different way. Antidiuretic hormone causes you to reabsorb water directly from the urine that's being formed. we typically are going to release antidiuretic hormone when we're experiencing a dehydration event. If your osmolarity of your bloodstream, if the concentration of your electrolytes in your body is getting too low, I misspoke, too high. If your concentrations are getting too high, you try to reabsorb more water from your urinary system to add water to your bloodstream to reduce the concentrations of those particular electrolytes in your body. Another name for antidiuretic hormone is vasopressin, and that's because antidiuretic hormone, in response to your falling fluid volumes, in response to your dehydration, will also cause your blood vessels to vasoconstrict. And if we think about this, if we're losing water from our bloodstream, we're becoming dehydrated, we have less blood, and if we have less blood, our blood pressure tends to go down. And in response to that decline in blood pressure, we're trying to maintain homeostasis, we'll release antidiuretic hormone, which causes us to reabsorb more water and causes our blood vessels to constrict and our blood pressure to go up in response to that vasoconstriction. We also have oxytocin, abbreviated as an OT. This is a multi-function hormone. When we think of oxytocin, most people typically associate this hormone with either birth or orgasm. So when someone achieves climax during sexual intercourse, either male or female, they will have a surge of oxytocin released. Oxytocin is going to cause smooth muscle contractions. So when we think of the male reproductive tract, those smooth muscle contractions in the male reproductive tract will initiate ejaculation. The smooth muscle contractions in the female reproductive tract are going to cause very mild contractions of the uterus and cause the cervix of the uterus to open up just a little tiny bit, not much. We also find that oxytocin can cause other smooth muscles in the body to contract. For instance, the smooth muscles of the digestive tract. There's a lactating mother I was talking to about hormones. She's a physician assistant, and she gave me permission to share this story. I'm not going to share her name, though. She had to go to the bathroom, but her child was also really, really hungry. She had to breastfeed her child. So she started breastfeeding her child, and during this breastfeeding response, during the stimulation of the nipple, oxytocin will cause smooth muscle contraction of the mammary gland to let the milk out. So oxytocin is for the flowing of milk. Prolactin makes the milk, oxytocin lets the milk out. But there's some other smooth muscles that were being contracted while this mother was breastfeeding, particularly the smooth muscles of her colon. So she's in a public place, she's breastfeeding, she's having smooth muscles contracting all over her body, and she ended up needing to change her underwear afterwards because she couldn't make it to the toilet in time. It was really gross, but kind of funny in hindsight. At the time, she wasn't excited about it. We also find that oxytocin is also referred to as the love hormone, because we typically find that when someone's exposed to an increase in concentration of oxytocin, they form, or are more likely to form, deeper emotional bonds with the individuals that are nearby them while they are being exposed to that oxytocin. So if we think of oxytocin and how it's associated with orgasm or breastfeeding, it makes sense how those actions help form very strong emotional bonds. And then we'll say, last question. One last review question. The blank secretes hormone, growth hormone, which is also known as somatotropin. Which gland that we've talked about so far secretes growth hormone? Sometimes also referred to as human growth hormone, sometimes also referred to as somatotropin. When you're done answering the question, that'll be it for the day. Yes. We're down to about 15 seconds. Get your answers in. Nice.